listening to the Factivist Sports Podcast, putting data back into sports conversation. Now for your hosts, Wyatt Simonik and Jake Kindle.
Hello and welcome to Factivist Sports. I'm your co-host Wyatt Simonik, and I'm joined here by Jake Kindle. Week 2 of college football is finally in the books. We saw some good things and some not so good things, of course. But Jake and I, like we said in our very first podcast, we're trying to keep this on, this podcast on a national level, cover some broad topics that our audience can appreciate. But inevitably, we are located here in Utah, so we are going to cover a couple things pertaining to Utah sports. And today, we'd like to dedicate this episode to something that Jake and I have been talking about for months now, related to BYU football. And since 2011, BYU, they took the plunge and they became an independent. They left the Mountain West Conference, and to be completely honest, Jake and I were pretty critical of the program. Jake, he was, like we said earlier, born and raised in Utah, and so he's been a lifelong BYU fan, but nonetheless, very critical of the program, giving credit where credit is due, but also at times when things aren't going so well, looking at ways to solve those issues. And today we're talking about an issue regarding to BYU and the lack of the AP Top 25 finishes that they've had over the course of the past couple of years since they've gone independent. And in our first episode, we covered the College Football Relevancy Index and the importance of finishing in the AP Top 25 at the end of the season. So today, Jake and I were going to cover what we think it might be the issue when it comes to BYU football and what they can do to kind of correct themselves in finishing as an AP Top 25 team season in and season out.
Okay, Wyatt, I got a couple questions for you. Pretend you are in charge of a department at your work, at a business.
Okay.
Your department has been underperforming for a while, and the executives schedule a meeting with you. They want to talk about it. Now, going into that meeting, what questions are you prepared to answer?
Oh, man. First of all, they're going to ask, why is your department underperforming? And I'd imagine after the why, it would be either what are you going to do to fix it or how are you going to fix it?
Yeah. What's going on and how are you going to fix it? What are you going to do about it? Exactly right. Okay, the next question is, what are the key factors to winning in college football? If you had to make a list and say, okay, you need these things in order to win and compete, what are you going to do?
First and foremost, roster. You got to have the talent to be competitive. We've covered this in previous episodes. You got to have good coaching, good head coach, good coaching staff, good at recruiting. And then, ultimately, it's got to be the teams you play. It's got to be the schedule.
Exactly right. Now, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is Alabama, okay? And Alabama was number 1 in our relevancy index. For those, if you didn't hear, we talked about them a lot because the last 10 years, they have 10 straight top 10 finishes, 5 national championships in 10 years. Okay, now, the opening weekend of the NFL happened last weekend. Alabama had the number 1 spot as far as the most players on NFL rosters on opening weekend. Okay, so they're the most talent. Then they have the coaching, like you said, Nick Saban. Enough said. Now the scheduling, we're going to talk more about that with BYU as we go on tonight. But with the scheduling with Alabama, one thing that I want people to look at is go look at their schedule and see who they play. Every year before the Iron Bowl, they play a UT Chattanooga,
no-name team,
a Tennessee Martin, some FCS school, right? They never play 2 or 3 of their toughest opponents in a row. They don't play Georgia, Auburn, and Florida in back-to-back weeks, okay? I'm just going to kind of leave that there, and then we're going to talk more about that. But what I want to dive into real quick is a little bit of BYU History 101, some key dates in BYU history. Okay, 1972, BYU promoted Lavelle Edwards to be the head coach. 1977, BYU finished with a 9-2 record, ranked in the AP rankings at number 20 for the first time. First AP final ranking in school history. Okay. Now, 1978 is another key date in BYU history. And this is one people aren't going to know, or they're not going to think about it a lot. But that was the year when Arizona and Arizona State left the Western Athletic Conference and joined the Pac-10. Now, that's significant because Arizona State was the premier program in the WAC. And so when they left, their departure
opens it up.
Opened the door for somebody else, right? Okay, and then 1979 through 1985. Okay, that is what I call the golden era of BYU football. Okay, and I'm going to run through some of these numbers real quick. So 1979, BYU was 11-1. They finished number 13 in the final rankings. 1980, they were 12-1. They finished number 12. 81, 11-2. They finished 13. 83, they were 11-1, and they finished number 7. That was the year they played Missouri. There's that highlight. Steve Young catches a halfback pass, goes in for the touchdown. Then 1984, we all know what happened that year. 13-0.
Yeah, national champions.
Beat Michigan in a bowl game.
Number 1.
Finished unanimously as the number 1 team in the country, right? Now, some people want to argue the validity of that national championship, but it is what it is. They finished ranked number 1 in the way that the system was set up. They beat all the teams on their schedule. And then 1985, they finished 11-3, final ranking of 16. Okay. Now, you mentioned those 3 things that we talked about: schedule, talent, coaching.
Yeah, coaching.
Okay, so during that, the golden years, the peak of BYU football, they had the perfect storm of those 3 things. So first, they had Lavelle Edwards, a Hall of Fame coach, and that was earlier on in his career. He kind of caught his stride. He figured it out after a few years. He'd gotten a great staff around him. So not just him, but he had guys like Doug Scoville and Ted Tollner. He had guys like Mike Holmgren.
Andy Reid.
Yeah, Brian Billick. So he groomed some great NFL coaches that were Super Bowl winners. He had great offensive staff. He also had other, defensive staff as well. But they also had talent. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, they went 5 quarterbacks in a row who were drafted into the NFL or played in the NFL. Gifford Nielsen, he played. He was on the Houston Oilers. They had Mark Wilson. He was on the Raiders. Then they had Jim McMahon. Jim McMahon was a Super Bowl winning starting quarterback for the Bears.
Yeah.
Steve Young, Hall of Famer, Super Bowl MVP, one of probably the top 20.
Most accomplished, one of the most accomplished NFL quarterbacks, for sure.
Retired as the most efficient quarterback in NFL history. And then Robbie Bosco. Robbie Bosco didn't really stick in the NFL, but he got drafted, okay? So they had those 3 things. Now, schedule, we just touched on Arizona and Arizona State leaving the conference. And so that kind of left the door open because the conference schedule got a little bit easier. It got less contentious. But the other thing is, in those years, from 79 to 84, probably 79 to 83 rather, they averaged only playing 2 P5 games per season. And then 83, they played 3, and then 84, they played 4, okay? 85 they played 4, and 84 they played 3. But they averaged about 2 P5 games over that span. So they built their pinnacle years, their golden years, off of having a great coaching, good quarterback play and talent, with very winnable schedules. Okay, and even with a winnable schedule, they mustered going undefeated one year. Now there was one year they lost one game. They lost by 1 point to Indiana in a bowl game. They went for 2 to go for the win instead of tying it up, but they didn't get it right. So anyway, after that, then the history kind of rolls on. After Bosco, there was kind of a lull in talent, and they also started playing more P5s. Instead of averaging 2 a year, they started playing 3. And then sometimes with the bowl game 4 a year, okay? And so,
difficulty goes up a little bit.
So when Ty Detmer was a senior, they played 3 P5s in a row. They played Penn State, Florida State, and UCLA. I don't have the order in front of me, but they played those 3 games in a row, and they lost all 3. But when they didn't have an NFL quarterback between Bosco and Detmer, they didn't finish in the top 25. But then when they had an NFL quarterback and he was the full-time guy as a sophomore, they went back into the top 25. Then, they struggled a little bit in the 90s, But in 94 they had a good year. 96 they were number 5, 14-1 record. And then the next significant date is 1999, and that's when the Mountain West Conference was formed after they dissolved the WAC. Okay, so half the teams left and made a new conference. 2000 is when LaVell was retired. Now 2005 is another significant year in their history because that's when Bronco,
right? Yeah, and Bronco gets hired.
Yeah.
Comes on board.
Kyle Whittingham was hired for a second, and then he made an about face, went and took the Utes job, and then they said, "Hey Bronco, why don't you be the guy?" And Bronco, he took over. They had a mediocre first year, 6-6, and then after that, he had 4 years in a row with top 25 seasons. And those seasons, they had John Beck as a senior, and then 3 years of Max Hall, and then after Max Hall left, Bronco never had another top 25 season. But the thing that happened as well is in 2011, as you mentioned earlier, they went independent. Okay. Now, I've been having a lot of conversations, a lot of debates with BYU fans because BYU fans, they love what independence brings to the table. Okay. And people talk to me about, okay, well, what are the goals and what are the expectations of independence? And we're going to dive into some of the results and some of the scheduling here in just a second. But the things that, to me, were promised or expected when they were going independent, one, it's not the fan favorite type of thing, but it's revenue, right? They were going to make more money, okay? They were going to get more exposure. They're playing on ABC this Saturday versus Wisconsin. They've had one game every year on ABC, Michigan, Nebraska, Wisconsin. These games have been on, ABC. And then the other things that were kind of, we were led to believe that we're going to go up, relevancy, because, they were going to be playing big brands on big stages and they were going to get more attention and the eyes were going to be on them. And then the other thing is they were going to have flexibility. And I'm going to talk more about those things later on, but the relevancy, as we talked about, remind me where they came in on the relevancy. What tier and what number?
So BYU, when the dust settled, they were the very first team in Tier 5, ranked tied, I believe, at number 43 with San Diego State. But as you and I discussed in a previous episode on our podcast, the reason why they're on our relevancy index is because we have a rolling 10-year program going, and their 08 and 09 seasons are the heavy contributors to the points that they were awarded. And going back to what you were saying, when you have John Beck and Max Hall, those were 2 NFL quarterbacks. And so, they had talent. They won some games. They were allotted points based on our relevancy index. But since going independent, they really haven't done anything. They've kind of fizzled. So independence started in 2011, okay? In 1977, as I mentioned earlier, BYU finished in the AP rankings for the first time. Between 77 and 2010, that's a 34-year span, they were ranked in the final poll 17 times, 50% of the time. On the dot.
Yeah. So, one was in the 70s, 6 were in the 80s, 4 in the 90s, and 5 in the 2000s. So pretty balanced. Now, like we said, they had a golden era where there were 6 out of 7 years. So they definitely had some ups and downs over that span.
But the trend basically is around 50%.
But you have a 3.5 decade trend where you are a top 25 program. Now, our relevancy index, we only did a 10-year span and we didn't go any further than that because relevancy, a lot of that we're talking about recency.
Yep.
Because 1984, and just like we talked about Nebraska or Miami, what you did with Jimmy Johnson and Tom Osborne as your coaches,
ago,
that doesn't matter anymore.
It's not relevant right now.
It matters to your history, to your fans, to your legacy, but it doesn't matter to today as far as what your product is today. Exactly like you said. So we have all of that here, but 2010 to 2018, there's no AP top 25 rankings for BYU. It's the longest drought in 40 years. Okay. And on top of that, there's a lot of excuses. What are some of the things if I said, okay, you're reading Twitter or you're talking to BYU fans, what are the typical reasons or excuses they're giving for that drought?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. The ones that I always see, there's coaching staff is inadequate. They don't have the talent to compete with the schedule that they have. I mean, ultimately, what I'm seeing is, now you and I, we're gonna dive into this, and this is a little spoiler. You and I believe that the leading contributor to BYU's lull in top 25 finishes is the schedule, the difficulty in schedule, and we'll dive into that because you and I, people will suggest that they don't have the talent that they used to, but you and I, when we go on, NCAA or ESPN, and you look, they have 9 people from in this decade on starting rosters. You go from Ziggy, Kyle Van Noy, Jamal, Taysom Hill. I mean, that puts them in. Now, this isn't necessarily the highest spot, but it puts them at the 61st spot as far as NCAA teams putting out talent into the NFL. So, I mean, they're roughly, 130 teams in the FBS. They're roughly around the halfway point there, right? With talent entering the NFL on starting day. So nothing crazy good, but still, it's not like they're not putting anybody in the NFL. And so you hear the coaching staff, a couple of years ago, they bring in Ty Detmer to be the OC, and it's, Ty's introducing an offense or a scheme, that Tanner Mangum or any other quarterback, they can't, fully utilize or put into effect. So what he's trying to do might be, work on an NFL scale, but not here at the collegiate level. And so there's all sorts of different excuses that are thrown out there, but nobody wants to look at their affiliation or their non-affiliation with a P5 or G5 and going independent and looking at the schedule, which you and I have done a deep dive with tons of data that we're going to cover.
So I've been on kind of all sides of this argument.
And of course, they're going to bring up the one thing which you should talk about, the causation versus correlation effect that was a term that was dubbed, I don't know, last year, that it kind of came into popularity, that anytime you and I want to dive into the data, they say, oh, well, you're pointing out a correlation, not a causation. And so,
Right. Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a minute. A couple points I want to bring up. So one question, if you have that list in front of you, do you know where Notre Dame ranks on the NFL list? Is that something you can see or find?
Let me pull
so
it up
this is what I want to pull up, what I want to say from this standpoint. So the talent standpoint, okay, there are 65 teams that are affiliated with a P5 conference plus Notre Dame. Now, our list, we're going to talk about that. We added a couple more, but there's 65 teams that are considered P5. Now, as an independent, according to the Rivals recruiting class rankings, since going independent, BYU's average recruiting class is number 66.
So just outside the halfway point, outside the P5 point.
So obviously, I think they're ahead of a few P5 programs because teams like Boise and Houston, some of these other G5s are ahead of them, but they're not even in the top 65. So,
but you'd think with the new contract, you're getting this attention. You're like you said earlier, you have an ESPN game, you're going to be on ABC. You'd think that it would help in recruiting. That, these people are saying, oh my gosh, BYU, they're on, the national scale. They're playing an afternoon game on ABC. They're playing against LSU. They're playing against Wisconsin. I mean, these big programs, right? These programs that rank really high on our index, so they're playing these relevant programs. You'd think that it would help recruiting, right?
Well, I mean, that's what we were led to believe, but the correlation between winning and recruiting is better. Okay. Now, there's a lot of things. Now, we're going to dive into the schedule, and we have a bunch of numbers. Okay. Now, tell me that Notre Dame number.
Notre Dame, so they rank 14th, and they have 26 players at the beginning of the season on an NFL roster.
Okay, so they rank number 14. Yeah. Where do they rank on our relevancy index?
I believe they're tier 3, and I want to say, I don't have it in front of me open up, but I want to say around 20. They're around the 20
around
mark.
23.
Somewhere
23
in there,
30.
yeah.
Okay.
I know they're above Utah, and Utah was the very first team in the tier 4 at 23. So I want to say Notre Dame is probably in the 20 spot, and as a tier 3 program.
Okay. Point is, though, that Notre Dame gets more talent than BYU because what BYU is trying to do essentially is they've been copied as this is the model that they want to follow is Notre Dame. And Notre Dame plays a tough schedule. I mean, because they play Stanford and USC every single year, and then they're contracted to play 5 ACC games every single year because they're a quasi member. They're not a football member, but they're in other sports for the ACC. And so that's 7 games. And then this year you throw in Michigan, that's 8.
Opened with Michigan.
They're playing 8 or 9 P5 games every year, but they have the brand. They're not as niche as BYU as far as, Catholic or Catholicism is a different animal than being a Mormon, right? But anyway, not to go off on that tangent too much, but some of the things when I get into these discussions with BYU fans, okay, I hear things like, well, BYU's just got to win more. The answer is just winning more. They just have to win. And then when I bring up the record for P5s and G5s or P5s and non-P5s, then fans say, well, there's P5's not a magic pill. It's just not a magic pill. It's not a formula. And, the numbers bear it all out as far as NFL talent, as far as relevancy rankings. So let's jump through this. Okay. I want to go through this. So we're going to dive into these numbers, but I also want to talk about something. You came up with this concept and this terminology. We call it the cluster. So tell us what the cluster is.
Yeah. So looking at BYU's schedule since 2011 going independent, we notice that there's something that occurs almost every single year. Now, I think there's one year where it doesn't, and then there's a couple years where it occurs twice. But we call it the P5 clusters. Now, what this means is BYU in their schedule, they schedule a P5 team either 3 times or 4 times in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. So whether it be in this order of P5, P5, G5, P5, we consider that a cluster. Or if it's 4 P5s in a row or 3 P5s in a row, we consider that a P5 cluster, or if it happens 2 times within a specific season. So if they start the season P5, P5, G5, P5, that's one cluster. And then towards the latter part of the season, if they go P5, 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 that's 2 clusters within one season. Now, when we were looking at this data, obviously we're covering all the big P5s, but also we threw in there Notre Dame, which is a lot of people do consider a P5, but they are independent. So we just want to clarify we consider them a P5, Boise State a P5, and TCU. Now, TCU, obviously, they are P5 now, weren't for part of this data that we collected, but always kind of finishing in the top 25. They're really high on our relevancy index. And Boise State, even though they are part of the Mountain West right now, they are top 10 on our relevancy index, basically always finishing in the top 25 at the end of the season. They huge bowl wins. So we considered those 3 additional teams as a P5, Boise State, TCU, and Notre Dame. So we went back, Jake and I, we went to every single season and we kind of laid out all of the data. So the total wins and losses, P5 wins and losses, non-P5 wins and losses, cluster, non-cluster, home away, neutral, bowl games, and then we broke down the cluster for every single week. So we could get an average of, within a cluster, a P5 cluster, how many times is BYU winning in week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And from there, we collected all the data. We looked back at every single season and ultimately we could see what the issue is and what's really affecting BYU's ability to finish as a top 25 team.
So Notre Dame's tier 3, number 21 on our list. So
we were close.
So yeah,
we were close.
So let's take a look. Exactly like you said. So I'm going to look at the clusters first. Well, actually, let's start with P5. And as the way we've broke it down, since going independent, overall BYU is 15-27 versus what we call P5 plus Boise plus TCU plus Notre Dame. Okay, that is 36% win percentage. So it's 36% winning
all
versus
the P5s.
P5
That's
programs.
not saying cluster. That's all the P5 programs.
Now, someone threw it out there on Twitter recently, and they said, "Hey, in Lavelle Edwards' career, he was 42% winning percentage versus P5s." Now, Lavelle Edwards, we'll talk about that. So 6% higher. But Bronco was better than that. Bronco was about 44% in the Mountain West. Under Bronco in the Mountain West, they were about 44%. In the Mountain West overall, they were about 44% when they were Mountain West versus a P5 program. Now, okay, versus the non-P5s, they are 42-9, and that's 82%. So that
good.
Equals any other conference, all the G5 conferences,
G5 other independent,
plus New Mexico State,
any other
and UMass,
like
and then FCS schools, right? So a 36% win percentage versus an 82% win percentage. Okay. Now the clusters, and I got to make sure that these numbers are all the way right, but we're going to go week by week. Okay. So in the first week of a cluster, so that's Arizona. BYU's in the middle of a cluster right now. Okay. Arizona, California, Wisconsin. Okay, that's 3 weeks. And then Washington will actually be the fourth in 5 week span.
Yeah.
So game number 1, BYU is 6-4 as an independent. Now there's been a year where they've had 2 different clusters in a year. 6-4 in game number 1, and there may be a couple years where that doubles up. Game number 2, they are 3-7.
So they fall from a 60% win percentage to a 30% win percentage. Just
Game
going
number,
from week 1 to 2.
Yeah, game number 3. So again, game number 3 could be the third in a row, or it could be the third in 4 week span.
Yeah.
They are 1-7. And that one win was 2012 versus Georgia Tech on the road.
Which is a 12% win percentage, 12.5.
Okay. And then game number 4, they are 0-2.
Yeah.
So by the numbers, okay. Now coming into this year, I was on Twitter telling BYU fans, like, look, BYU's going to start, they're going to start 2-3. That's just the math of it. They're going to start 2-3 because they play Arizona, Cal, they play Washington, then they play McNeese State at home. They'll probably win that game. And then they play Wisconsin, or then they play Washington. So Wisconsin, Washington, maybe I flipped those. But they're going to lose to Wisconsin in all likelihood, and they're going to lose to Washington in all likelihood. Okay? So in those games, and again, we're not even diving into where the games are played, home, neutral, away. It's just the week and the succession. And so, as I said, in the golden era of their program, they were playing 2 P5s, maybe 3 some years, and they were winning 11 or 12 games a year. They were ranked in the top 16, the top 10. They were relevant. They were national brand. They had, a good coach. They had good players. Now, so one other thing to mention about this record, okay? Who do you think is the only NFL quarterback in BYU history to not have a top 25 finish in his career?
Oh, this is easy because we were just talking about it. It's Taysom Hill.
Okay.
Because he played and they haven't finished in the AP top 25.
Okay, so one of the excuses that BYU fans, and I'm going to jump into a couple seasons specifically, okay? So when I talk about the record, and this is exactly what I tell people. I say, listen, the reason that they haven't finished in the top 25 as an independent is because of the schedule. Now, when you bring that up, the fans automatically get in defense mode because they think that you're saying, well, we should just go back to the Mountain West. Well, this means we should go back to the Mountain West, right? And I'm not necessarily saying they need to go back to the Mountain West. But what I am saying is if they want to win and be relevant, improve their recruiting, improve their attendance in their home stadium instead of, not getting embarrassed on opening night, then they need to they need to adopt more of a Mountain West scheduling model. Okay. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I'm going to run through some of these seasons real quick. Okay. So 2011, their losses were an away loss to Texas and an away loss to Utah. And those were games 2 and 3 in a cluster. Okay, and then they also lost a neutral game to TCU. They finished 10-3 that year, and the P5s as we have defined them, they were 2 and 3 in those P5 games, 8-0 in the non-P5 games. So if you play 1 or 2 less P5 games, instead of playing 5, you play 4.
4, yeah.
Now you're an 11-win team. You're in the top 25. Now that year they were one spot out anyway. They finished in the coaches poll, but they didn't finish in the AP poll. Okay, 2012. Let's look at this year. So 8-5 total. Okay, their losses were Utah away and Boise State away. And those were games 2 and 3 in a cluster. Okay. They lost at home at Oregon State and at Notre Dame. Game 1 and 2 in a cluster, and then they beat Georgia Tech. That's the one year they won a third game of a cluster.
And that's that unique year where they actually had 2 clusters in the same year.
So that year they finished 2-4 versus P5 teams and 7-1 versus non-P5 teams. Now, look, people say injuries. Well, injuries, yeah. Riley Nelson, he played good in 2011, 2012. He got banged up in a couple games in, and he just wasn't the same. He wasn't the same player. Taysom Hill stepped in for a couple games, then he got hurt. And so, and then they threw James Lark in there towards the end of the year. So they had a quarterback carousel. But regardless of that, they had an opportunity to win more games. And, they scheduled 6 P5 games, 2-4 record. Okay, 2013. Now this is the year when people say, Taysom Hill is a great quarterback. This year, they were 8-5. Okay, those P5 games, they were 3-5 versus P5s. So counting Boise State as a P5 game, 3-5, and Boise's one of those wins that year. So they played 8. That's a full P5 schedule that year. Okay, these are their losses: away at Texas, game 1 of a cluster, home to Utah, game 3 of a cluster. And then they lost to at Wisconsin on the road, at Notre Dame on the road, and Washington in a bowl game. Those are their losses. Okay, so again, 8-5. You dial that back a couple games, you have another potential top 25 season. Now, one of the other things that fans always tell me when they say, hey, when I say AP drought, top 25 drought, fans always jump back to 2014. And they say, look, BYU's 4-0, they're playing Utah State, they're ranked in the top 25, and then Taysom got hurt. But what's the significance of 2014? Why should we look at this year as the model for BYU scheduling? Listen to this schedule. Week 1, who do they play in that year?
Play Connecticut.
Okay. Connecticut, who's a Tier 7 program.
Yeah.
A G5 Tier 7. Week 2.
They got Texas, which Texas at that time was kind of, not the powerhouse team that they once were, but they come out with a victory.
Okay, then games 3 and 4.
Houston, Virginia, which Houston, they rank Virginia nothing, Tier 7.
Okay, and then they didn't play another P5 until week number 9, Boise State, which they lost, and then week 13, California, which they won.
Yeah, no clusters this year at all when it comes to P5.
Okay. So what people say is they say, listen, we're undefeated and this is the year. And what they don't understand is they're arguing one thing against me, and they're proving my point by bringing up 2014 as the example of the year that would have been the special year. Well, that would have been our special year. You're probably right. It probably would have been your special year had Taysom not got hurt. But 2013, Taysom wasn't hurt. 2016, Taysom wasn't hurt. We'll talk about 2016 in a second. But the reason 2014 would have been special is because of the schedule. No clusters, no back-to-back P5 games, no 3 in a row, no 3 and 4, none of that. Now, it was a weird year because after Taysom got hurt, they lost 4 games in a row. They lost Utah State, UCF, Nevada, and then Boise State. Then they won 4 in a row, and then they lost their last game. So they had the most winnable schedule of their tenure. Now in the bowl game, they played a close game, Memphis and Paxton Lynch. Okay, now I'm going to jump on to the 2015 and 2016. We're not going to really talk about 2017. That was just kind of a down year altogether. But 2015, they start off with a cluster of 4 games. They win at Nebraska, Hail Mary. They win Boise State game, Hail Mary.
Hail Mary.
And then they played away and they versus UCLA. Game 4 of that cluster, what happened versus Michigan?
Got completely blown out.
Okay, shutout.
Yeah, 31-0?
35, 38,
30,
nothing.
Yeah, something like that.
I tried to block it from my memory, but...
Yeah, but 4 P5s in a row to start the season.
Yeah.
Finishing
and the fourth
with Michigan.
One,
at Michigan.
At Michigan in the big house with a resurgent program who's just brought in Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah.
and they're just got manhandled and tossed around that field. But this schedule, these rosters and these players, they weren't built to play that stretch of games. I mean, Nebraska's only tier 4, Boise State's a tier 2, UCLA and Michigan are both only tier 4s. So they're playing 3 tier 4 teams as far as P5s, but it's still P5 talent. And as we said in our relevancy index, UCLA, when we talk about the most underperforming programs, along with the Miami Hurricanes, UCLA is going to be one of those as far as producing talent and not winning, right? So that year, 9-4 overall, 2-4 versus P5, 7-0 versus non-P5. So again, we're clustering Boise in with the P5s, but remember they ranked number 10 in our relevancy index. Okay, so then 2016, real quick. Start the season off with a win versus Arizona. Then they play 3 P5s in a row. Utah at Utah loss, UCLA at home loss, West Virginia neutral loss. Now, that was a year where every one of those games was close. They had a chance. They were within, a field goal or a touchdown, but they were all losses. Okay, and then they had another stretch where they had another cluster. Michigan State win, Mississippi State win, but then Boise State a loss. So again, you're playing Boise State on the road after going to play at Michigan State,
and then you have Mississippi
and home
State
versus Mississippi State.
And again, in that year, against P5s, because they played 7, they finished 3-4, but then non-P5s, it's 6-0 again. So previous year, 7-0, this year, 6-0. So there's obviously a trend when it comes to playing non-P5s and P5s that are clustered.
Now, I've dabbled in sports blogging and analysis for years, contributed to a couple blogs in the past, but one of the things I wrote early on in independence is I said the biggest key to independence was going to be balance and balancing the schedule. And that's what we're talking about with the cluster. So my suggestion to fix this, and do you have anything you want to touch on?
No, I was just going to say after doing an analysis on the data, and we already talked about this, you had mentioned, and we haven't quite come back full circle to it, is Alabama, how they have their schedule. Towards the very end part of the year, right before the Iron Bowl, they play some no-name team, and they beat up on them, and the SEC, Alabama, obviously they're the gold standard and in our index, but they have a schedule that is tailored for them to win. It's built for them to win. And when you look at BYU's schedule, and we've already talked about the recruiting classes, we've already talked about, X, Y, and Z, their schedule is just not built for them to win. It's very difficult, and the data shows us, it's very difficult to play 7 P5 teams when you don't have necessarily P5 talent like you already talked about. Their recruiting class falls in, is 66. It's difficult to go on the road 3-4 times, to go face these P5 opponents and expect to come out with a win. And we've already broke down the data. When you get into a cluster, week 3 and week 4, you have only won 1 game out of 9 attempts. You are 1 for 9 when it comes to clustering these P5 programs and playing them in week 3 and week 4 and expecting to have a win. The data just, it goes against everything you think. And
yeah,
so,
and these are tier 4 programs like Mississippi State, West Virginia. These aren't tier 1 or tier, these aren't Wisconsin.
We even broke down. Luckily, we use our relevancy index. We even broke it down a little bit further. So when BYU is actually playing a team in the relevancy index from 1 to 42, so the Ohio States, the Michigans, the Miamis, the UCLAs, they're 16-26. They have a 38% win percentage when they're playing a team better than them in the relevancy index. Now, teams that they're playing, when they play a team that ranks lower than them, tiers 5 through 8, they have an 80% win percentage. They're 41-10. So when you're looking at this, you just look at the data and you say, okay, our win percentage against P5s, especially when we cluster, it's only like 33%. But when we're playing non-P5s, or when we're playing a P5 that's not clustered, our win percentage is much higher. And when we're playing those, those G5s or those, those other teams in between, we have an 80% win percentage. Why isn't anyone looking at the data and trying to resolve their scheduling woes with the data.
One thing I want to touch on two things before we wrap this up. The first one's going to be the SEC. Okay, Alabama. We're not going to do a deep dive into the scheduling and analytics of them, but the SEC dominates college football. I know Clemson's won recently. I know Ohio State has won recently, but the SEC had won, X number of years in a row in the last 10 years. Alabama's won and Auburn's won. So there's at least 6 of the last 10. Yeah. But what we should point out is I hear a lot of Pac-12 fans or other fans, and they say, like, listen, the SEC isn't doing it the right way. They need to play 9 conference games. They need to do this and that. The Pac-12, in my opinion, hamstrings their programs. And I still can't believe, every year that I go into the season, I cannot believe that they don't fight against the conference to change their scheduling requirements. Because the Pac-12, they have a couple of exceptions because of the Stanford and the USC.
The Notre Dame game.
Notre Dame's, yeah. Right? But they tell their teams, you have to play within the first 4 or 5 weeks of the game, of this 4 or 5 games of the season. Yeah. You have to play all of your non-conference games, which is asinine and ridiculous, because there was they showed last year that a Friday night marquee matchup, a short week turnaround road game, is when their top programs had suffered their losses. The Pac-12 is hamstringing themselves and their college football playoff appearances. And I think the other major conferences are doing that as well. The SEC is not doing that. And I can't guarantee this, but the SEC probably comes out with a schedule, sends it to Alabama, and Alabama says, no, you can do better than that. Let me show you some adjustments. They dictate it because that's the cash cow. They're the ones that win. And the SEC makes it easier for them to win because they give them more control over their schedule. They can play their non-conference games whenever they want. Now, a couple things for BYU fans. BYU fans are saying to me, playing games in October is a pipe dream. We can't play any games in October. P5s just don't do it. Okay, now they have a short memory because 2016, okay, game number 6, Michigan State, game number 7, Mississippi State. They play P5 teams in every single month, okay? Now, the solution and the fix for BYU is simple. And we've already gone on for a while today, so we'll try to cover this in just a couple minutes. But I've been on different sides of this argument. When I first started getting into this data, I said they need to go back to the Mountain West Conference. I've kind of changed my tune on that because I'm saying, listen, if they go back to the Mountain West Conference for all sports, they're going to cut their revenue by, 75% or 66%. And that doesn't necessarily make sense. So here's my solution. The Gonzaga Bulldogs did BYU a huge favor in basketball last year because they flirted with the Mountain West. They got the West Coast to ante up on some things that they wanted. And they ultimately told the Mountain West, no thanks. What Tom Holmoe and BYU should do right now is they should call the Mountain West Conference and they should say, look, we are bringing all of our sports back to your conference to make you a 12-team conference for basketball and the other sports because Hawaii's not, they don't have they only have football in there. And then we're creating a scheduling agreement, a scheduling alliance. BYU's already playing Boise every year. They're already playing Utah State. They're already playing Hawaii regularly, UNLV. They've played San Jose State and Fresno State. They've got San Diego State coming up on schedules, Wyoming. They're already playing the majority of the conference besides New Mexico and the Colorado schools. And so people are like, why would you go back to the Mountain West? Because you've already are scheduling those teams. Well, I said something earlier, and it was about flexibility. The problem with being independent, one major problem is year 1, 2, and 3 on the schedule, you got a wide open slate. Team calls you and says you want to play, you can put them on any date you want. Well, now 5 or 6 years out, a team calls you and wants to schedule a game, you have no flexibility. You have no open dates. You're stuck. So what you do if you're BYU, you join the Mountain West Conference for all of your other programs, and we'll talk about basketball on another day and how the West Coast has killed that team and that move has killed their program. But you have a couple of stigmas on this. You have a couple of qualifications you need. Number one, you need a scheduling agreement. But with that scheduling agreement, you don't have any of those games scheduled on a date until they release their conference schedule. And that usually happens in, early in the year. Okay. So what does that mean? If you guarantee 4 or 5 games versus a Mountain West team every single year, then what you do is now you have 4, 5, or 6 open weeks. You have weeks where you can move and adjust and schedule future games. You just need to leave those spots open, and then you can plug in the Mountain West games that you have scheduled when it comes time to create the conference schedule. That gives you flexibility. Now, people are telling me this is, some people say, yeah, it's a crazy idea, will never happen. But like you said before, if I'm going into the executive boardroom, then I'm sitting down at that table and I'm giving them a solution on how to fix my problem. Well, we have the longest AP drought in 40 years. Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, because we're playing too many Power 5 teams. And number two, because of when we're playing them. We can't play 4 in a row, 4 in 5 weeks, 5 in a row, and expect to win those games because the results just aren't there. We don't have the talent and the depth to do that. And we're not adding the talent because we're losing too much to recruit better. Okay, so the fans are telling me, these are pipe dreams and we just need to win. And I'm telling the fans and I'm telling the school, if you want to win, you have to set yourself up for win. You have to put yourself in a position to be successful.
It doesn't magically just happen.
Yeah, magically hoping,
we just need to win more. That's not a solution.
Yeah,
that's not a solution.
It's not.
You go back to the boardroom. Well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to make more money. Well, what?
It's like the Cleveland Browns coming in and saying, "Well,
we're going to the Super Bowl.
How are you going to fix this?" Well, we just got to win more.
Yeah.
Well,
we're going to win.
You got to add more talent. You got to coach. You got to do all the other things. So if you're BYU, you got to control what you can control, and you got to take your future into your hands. And if it means cutting some games off your schedule, so my recommendation is this: no more back-to-back P5s. Because the winning percentage goes drastically down. When you play one-off P5s, they're winning about 45% of the time. Game ones of clusters, they're winning 60%, 6 out of 10. The rest of the games, week 2, 30%, and then it drops and it drops. So you've already shown you, I'm showing you the data, and I'm putting not only P5s, but according, based on the recommendation from some people that I've interacted with, well, you got to put good teams in there. Okay. We'll put P5s. We'll put Boise in there with them because Boise's a top 10 tier 1, tier 2 program on our list. And so when people come back at me with all of these things, they have an excuse and an answer. Some of the things that fans are saying, they're saying, well, it's misleading to say that BYU's on the biggest drought, and the winnings down because they're averaging the same number of wins now as they were in the Mountain West. Well, that might technically be true by fractions, but when they were in the Mountain West, they finished in the AP Top 25, 06 through 09, 4 years in a row. They have 0 of those in 7 years, which is still the longest drought. So you can throw in a few losing seasons to pull that average down and then say, well, the averages are the same. Then they say the strength of schedule. Okay. Our friend who answered one of our questions on their podcast the other day, the Sports Bros, they talked about, well, hey, the strength of schedule, there's no correlation between strength of schedule and wins and losses. But that's because you're playing 5 P5s or higher tier schools in the first 5 weeks, and then you're playing 5 tier 7 schools in a row. So the tier 7 pulls your strength of schedule down a lot, but it's still, the numbers are what they are. So you can take a high level number, just a small number, or you can look at it and deep dive into the specifics. So Wyatt, what should BYU do?
Honestly, they need to look at adjusting their schedule. Like you said, you nailed it. You gave them a suggestion on what they should be doing. Ultimately they need, like you said, they need to take their schedule in their own hands, and they need to figure out a way to maximize it so they can start winning more. You and I, we broke down the data and we delivered it here in this podcast. It's foolish for them or for fans to think that, Just because you're playing these big teams on national TV, that your team's relevant. It's just not. If you're not winning, you're not relevant. You and I have already discussed that. And we've broke down the data that the way that they can change their schedule and the way that they should change their schedule will ultimately allow them to start winning and hopefully break this drought that you're talking about.
Yeah, create that go to the Mountain West, create the scheduling alliance, require that the Mountain West give you the games, not solidify the dates until they finalize their conference schedule. And that gives you, and then what you do is next year, you're Tom Homo this offseason, you're playing 4 games in a row, Utah, Tennessee, Washington, USC next year. You call up 2 of those teams and you say, hey, I want to honor the game. I love you. I want to play you, but we got to move it in later in the season. We got to move it to another year. You got to bump some of those.
Now, fans are going to say this is a pipe dream. This is way more difficult than you're making it sound like, and that's not going to be the fix that we need. Like you said, we just need to start winning. We need our head coach. We need our coaching staff and our players to unite, and we need them to start winning.
2014 4-0 start didn't happen magically. It happened because they played UConn, and then they played Texas. And then they played, a pretty formidable program at home, Houston. But then they played a Tier 7 P5, Virginia is a bad P5. And they didn't play another P5 until they played Boise week 9 and Cal week 13. That was the schedule that was set up for them to be successful. All of the other schedules, they weren't. Maybe 2011 a little bit, and maybe 2014.
Now, what do you think it does to a program like an independent? So it's even more difficult to get, into a big bowl. You're not competing for a conference championship. What does it do to a team or a player when you have 4 or 5 P5s scheduled back to back, and you come out 1-4 or 2-3? What does that do to you? Does that boost or does that hurt your morale? What do you think the psychological effects are there?
Well, one thing we didn't talk about, but Utah, we haven't even brought them up today. Okay, so Utah,
we'll cover them later. Yeah,
their scheduling model is they play in their first 3 games, and this year is a little bit different, but they play an FCS team, they play a Mountain West or a lower level G5 team, and they play BYU. So they usually come out 3-0, and then like last year, 3-0, they can finish 3-6, and they're 6-6 going to a bowl game. And so they're confident. In some of those years where they were 5-4 in their conference and their record was a little inflated, 8-4, and then they go win a bowl game. So now they're 9-4. Their confidence got raised because they beat some lower level teams, and then they ride into the season,
exactly.
Right? But Utah's running into the same problem because they're playing, and we haven't looked at their cluster record, and maybe that's something we should. But their cluster record, it's probably similar results to BYU. Game 3, game 4 in a row. That's why they're losing. Why have they had, Witt's November struggles? Why? Well, because they went from the Mountain West to the Pac-12, and now they're playing 7, 8, or 9, 7 or 8 games in 9 weeks versus P5 teams, and they're just not. They haven't been able to sustain that, and that's BYU. And to answer your morale question, yeah, it's hard on your morale. You lost. Now, the other thing we haven't even touched on or talked about, and we don't have necessarily the numbers to back it up, but injuries. How many injuries were there last year for BYU? You play bigger, stronger, faster games, consecutive weeks. You're going to have more injuries and more injuries, and you just don't have the depth to compete anymore.
Injuries in clusters or against P5s opposed to out of P5s. That would be interesting data to look at.
I think if the 2017 BYU team, if that schedule was arranged completely different and there wasn't a cluster of those 3 games in a row, there was one in September, one October, one November, BYU probably goes bowling last year and finishes with the winning record. Or they finish, 6 or 7 wins.
Yeah, better than a 4-9 season.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, guys, I think we're going to wrap it up for this episode. We talked about a lot of different things, a lot of data, a lot to take in, but hopefully, we laid out something that you guys can follow along with, something that kind of shows our position and kind of what we think about BYU and what they need to do in order to maintain their success and get back to their winning record and finishing as a top 25 team in the nation. As Jake said, the trend for for close to 40 years you were saying, 50 or 30, I guess 34 seasons, 17% or 17 out of those 34 seasons, 50% of the time they were finishing AP top 25, and now they're in a big drought. So, we laid out a suggestion. Let us know what you guys think in the comments. We'll be posting all of our data that Jake and I have collected onto our website, factivistsports.com. There you guys can go and see, in written form, the data that we have, see our opinions. Let us know what you guys think about it. You can follow us on Twitter and obviously on our YouTube, and follow our podcasts. Jake, anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Couple things. When I've asked point blank, I asked a BYU fan on Twitter that was arguing with me. They said they said that I was wrong about the P5 stuff. I said, okay, if you're put in charge of BYU program, your goal is to win 10 games every year. What's your first move? And they said adjusting the schedule. And then the correlation versus causation. The founder and the president of that club, and he knows who he is. I asked him point blank on Twitter, okay, so are you telling me, because you're saying that it's a correlation, it's not a causation of the schedule changes and the wins and losses. So are you telling me that the P5 schedule and the independent schedule they're playing has nothing to do with the amount of increased losses? And he said no. He admitted that it has something to do with it. So these guys that are throwing that argument out there, you know who you are. You're just hiding behind what you think is I'm pushing a move back to the Mountain West. And as you've heard, my move is a little different than others. But thanks for joining us, guys.